Greetings and welcome to another lecture in Introductory Psychology. This one involves the midlife crises, and no, that's not a typo. The plural of crisis is crises. It's not crises, okay? It's crises. And yes, indeed, there is more than one midlife crisis. There's actually 3 that I'm going to talk about, although 2 of them are reserved for parents, as part of your reward for reproducing, I suppose. Now, the first midlife crisis is the more global one, and hence it has the name, the midlife crisis. And it's called this because, here in the U.S., it tends to occur around what we would consider to be midlife. Women tend to run into the midlife crisis at about age 35. Men tend to run into it a few years later, age 40. This is a pattern, by the way, that we see in a number of things. Women tend to hit puberty younger than men. Women tend to talk sooner than men. But at any rate, the midlife crisis tends to hit right around that time. And again, remember, these are averages. You may be sooner or later than this. Now, what causes the midlife crisis is probably any of a number of things. Although a big probable cause has to do with something called a social clock. Now, a social clock is your idea of where you want to be by a certain age, or even in a certain time period. In 5 years, I want to have accomplished this. By the time I'm 30, I want to have accomplished that, and so forth and so on. And a lot of us when we're young, most of us, maybe all of us when we're young, tend to make these plans. We tend to have these social clocks, and the clock is always ticking. Are we going to get there in time? Are we going to get there when we expect to? And that's part of the problem, because oftentimes, by the time we run into our late 30s, early 40s, that's a time when a lot of these deadlines for the social clock start to come through. And so we run into the deadlines, and either we are not where we want to be, we may not even be close to where we wanted to be. You may have decided, for instance, that by age 40 you want to be married and have children and be well settled in a career and have done all this, traveling or written your first book or whatever. And it's possible by age 40 you haven't done any of those things. Or what's even worse in some ways, you find that you have achieved all of your goals and you find that you hate them. That the goals do not make you happy, that it is not what you wanted to do. Either way, as I mentioned, these start to catch up with us around late 30s and early 40s. The other thing that starts to catch up with us in late 30s and early 40s is aging. Most people can ignore aging for quite a while, depending on how dissipated a life you lead, since it is possible to age yourself through not living properly, not eating well, not sleeping, drinking, and drugging to excess can age you faster. But most of us can ignore the signs of aging if we're not professional athletes or models until we're probably in our late 30s, early 40s. But at that point, you're beginning to realize that those little laugh lines are sticking around when you're not laughing. And the gray in your hair is coming through. And your hair might be coming out. And you're gaining weight. You can't bounce back from binging the way you used to. All those signs of aging starts to catch up with you. So between these 2 things, the social clock and aging beginning to make itself evident, a lot of people, when they're having a midlife crisis, sort of fall into the same patterns, whether they're male or female. They try to make believe that they are younger than they actually are. Males, for instance, will go out and buy a sports car. They will trade in their wife for a younger model. They will wear clothes that really are in fashion for younger people. They'll listen to younger people's music. They'll talk like younger people. They'll get facelift. And women do the same thing. It's not only men these days that will trade in an older spouse for a younger one. And the women can get a facelift and again dress younger, act younger, that sort of thing. And that serves a couple of purposes. The first is, of course, if you're 20, 25 years old and you haven't done the things on your social clock, who cares? You have plenty of time yet. So if you're 40 and you make believe that you're 20 and you make everyone else try to believe that you're 20 or 25, then you have plenty of time left to do those things you haven't done. And of course, if you're 25, then you're not 40 and you're not growing older and you're not going to die soon and get old, maybe, well, probably not in that order. And so, you're going to be young forever, sort of thing. We have this idea in the U.S. that we need to be young forever. And so that's why people start falling into those particular patterns. Now, not everybody has a midlife crisis. That's something you need to realize. Some people don't have any midlife crises. Some people have a whopping huge one. Some people might have 2 or 3 midlife crises. But so it's not universal, but you may also notice that sometimes people have little tiny midlife crises. They hit 40 or whatever, and you'll notice that they're not going whole hog and quitting their job to, skipper a sailboat around the world or whatever, but they're suddenly doing their hair a little younger, or they're suddenly driving that sports car. So it is possible to have a minimal midlife crisis, and it's possible that an awful lot of us have those. Maybe even so small we don't really notice them. Now, as I mentioned, the next 2 midlife crises are reserved for parents. The first one is called the empty nest. This is a bird analogy. And of course, the idea is that by a certain point, all of the children have grown up and have moved out. The parental nest is empty. Now, this used to be a very big deal, particularly for women. It was never as huge a deal for men as it was for women. Men were thought they could get through this, but women, women thought that once their children grew up and moved out, that they were pretty much done with. They stick around and see the grandchildren, but you're basically forcibly retired, often at a fairly young age. We don't see that as much anymore with women. Women now are more on par with men in terms of not having this be a huge big deal. Probably because these days in the U.S., women have a lot more roles open to them other than simply being a mother. It used to be that being a mother and being a wife almost secondarily was what every woman was going to be, and that when you were done being a mother, when you could no longer have children, or when your children were grown, it meant that you were old and useless and just waiting around to die kind of thing. Nowadays, of course, women can have careers and do have careers along with children or maybe after children. A lot of people, when their kids grow up, they decide to try something new. They decide to go back to college. They decide to try a new career. They decide to pick up new hobbies and things. And remember, I talked in a prior lecture about that marital satisfaction goes down when you have kids. Well, a lot of couples find that they're happier with one another once the kids have grown up and left. So the empty nest is not nearly as big a deal as it used to be, but that's okay because we've replaced it. Instead of the empty nest, or perhaps after the empty nest, now we have what are called boomerang kids. So called because if you throw a boomerang correctly, it will of course return to you. And the idea with boomerang kids is that the kids have moved out. They've moved out to go to school, they went in the military, or they got married, or they got a job, and then they lost the job, they got divorced, they can't find another job, they get out of college, and so what do? They move back home. We're seeing an awful lot of this in times where the economy is not very good, because then it makes sense for the kids to come home and live, and so that they can, everybody can share the rent or the mortgage and help pay for things, or if you can't find a job, it makes more sense to come and stay with your parents than to, might make more sense. So we see a lot more of that. Now, people have actually been living in multi-generational homes for probably as long as we've had humanity. This is not a new thing. It used to be that pretty much everybody was living in the same home. You'd have children and parents and grandparents, and sometimes great-grandparents all in the same house. But in the U.S., we really don't do that anymore. That isn't something that we see a lot of. And one of the big problems with this idea of boomerang kids these days is the possibility of what is known as role conflict. Now, role conflict is when the person's role is conflicting with what others think that they should behave. The boil it down to this situation is, and I have to tell you this, that on some level, you will always be a child to your parents. Always. They will always look at you and they will always see that little child that you were. And on some level, they're going to want to treat you like that little child. It can be difficult for parents to learn to treat their children as adults, simply because they've never really had to do that. So an adult child moves away and comes back home. Now, the adult child expects to be treated like an adult because the adult child is an adult. They're 24 years old or whatever. They're an adult. But the parents have a tendency to look at that adult child, and instead of seeing someone who's 24, they see someone who's 4. And so the adult child is living at home, and the adult child may want to go out with friends, and the parent, not surprisingly, is going to say, "So, where are you going? Who are you going to be with? When are you going to be back?" And the adult child says, "I'm 24 years old. I don't have to tell you these things. I could just go out and do what I want." And the parent says, "As long as you live under my roof," and it tends to go downhill from there. So, and it doesn't help, by the way, when adult children, oftentimes, once they move back home, they kind of expect to be treated like children. Who's going to do the laundry? Well, mom's going to do the laundry. Dad's going to put gas in the car. Mom's going to go to the groceries and cook the meals and everything. Yeah, if you parents treat you like you're 8, don't be surprised if they treat you like you're 8. Okay? If you let them treat you like a child in all the other ways, then don't be surprised when they treat you like a child in terms of asking you where you're going and when you're going to be back. So the way to get around this, probably best, is before the cohabitation begins, before the kids move back home, is to sort of sit down with everybody and say, okay, how long is this going to be for? Is it limited duration or not? Is there going to be rent charged? If so, how much, and what will happen if the rent is not paid? What about chores? How are we going to take care of those? What about groceries? We're going to chip into groceries, chip in for utilities. What about, to get all of that laid out before the adult child moves back in. Is this going to prevent role conflict? No, it isn't. But it may minimize its effect if everyone knows what is expected of them. And if it's going to bother you, if your parents ask you where are you going and who you're going with, discuss that in this initial meeting.